The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sharon Goldman. I am the program director for the Hoffmann Center for Jewish Life. And on behalf of the 92nd Street Y, I welcome you to the event this evening, Judaism, Science, and God. Before I welcome our speakers today to the stage, I want to take a moment to invite you personally to a few of our upcoming events. On Thursday, February 22nd, we have a really special opportunity to see the screening of, it's called The Tribe, which is a Sundance and Tribeca Film Festival special selection. And it's an unorthodox view of Jewish identity through the lens of the Barbie doll. So, it's received rave reviews, and with a discussion afterward with both the filmmakers, there's going to be spoken word and performance. On Friday, February 23rd, we have one of our monthly Shabbat dinners, and this Friday night is going to be the No Shh Shabbat dinner for parents with children under 24 months. So if not for you, if you have any friends or friends of friends who have little ones, please tell them about our upcoming Shabbat dinner. And on Monday, February 26th, we have a special event in our Stars of David series. On Monday, February 26th, we welcome Charles Grodin as he speaks about his relationship to Judaism. And now I'd like to introduce our guests. Rabbi David Nelson is the Associate Director of ARZA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America. He is the author of Judaism, Physics, and God, Searching for the Meaning in a Post-Einstein World. Roald Hoffman won the 1981 Nobel Prize for Chemistry. He is also a writer of poems, plays, and nonfiction works that explore the relationship between science, poetry, and philosophy. Sure, for a very interesting evening, and I welcome to the stage Roald Hoffman and Rabbi David Nelson. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm David Nelson. It is a pleasure to be here. It's especially a pleasure because the last time I was here at the Y, the procedure was that we accepted questions only on 3x5 cards, which were then screened carefully and read by someone with a lovely voice who chose which questions to ask and which not to ask. And the questions were all at the end, which kind of blocked any possibility for real interaction between the them and the us. So we're not doing that this evening, which is just lovely in my opinion. What we want to do is discuss science and religion, science and Judaism in particular, and invite your comments and questions as we go along. Not from the very beginning. I mean, you can't ask a question now because we haven't said anything yet. But soon we'll say something, and then you can ask questions, and we'll see where we go.
Let me just say,
sure, please,
why I am happy to be here. It's been a long time. I've been here once or twice before, but most indelibly this is burned into my mind, the place where we are, and in particular that sidewalk out there. For reasons which some of you of a certain age will recognize, that this was the place of departure for kids to Jewish sort of summer welfare camps about 40 or 50 years ago. And I remember waiting out there a year after we came to America at age 12 for the bus that would take us to Camp Tranquility. The year after, it was Camp Juvenile. Those were the names of the places that were here, but I remember it very clearly.
Tranquility. Isn't that
that's
a moon base?
Yes, a place on the moon where they landed.
So I'd like to start out. First of all, I should just say it's a real honor and privilege for me to be here, especially because it's given me an opportunity to meet and get to know Professor Roald Hoffman. And rabbis don't generally get to meet Nobel laureates in chemistry, so it's a real delight. I want to start out with a question. My question is it your sense that scientists, not exclusively, not without exception, but largely are hostile to religion or are somewhat threatened by religion, put off by religion? And if that's an accurate perception, why you think that is the case?
I think it's true, David. Overall, it's some sense it's a throwback to 19th century opposition. So the president of Cornell, Andrew Dixon White, wrote a book in 1890, The History of the Warfare of Science and Christianity. And so it comes from a time of facile rejection of religion. What's curious is it's come back, as people have seen in various books, which like ones by Dawkins or Weinberg or others. There is a hostility. Now, often hostility, as in other things, is a betrayal of insecurity or uncertainty. Why are they fighting this? So we know why they're fighting it, because in the middle ground of interaction of science and religion are their influences on the social contract and the government that we live in under the laws, and whether they are, whether it is in Israel or here, and in particular the kinds of things around creationism in the schools and trying to impose that agenda, the creationist agenda under the guise of intelligent design, which seems to rile scientists. Again, a certain feeling of insecurity about underneath about why haven't we taught this better? And crossing over to some insecurity about the intelligence of the people that they're teaching, which is even worse. So I think there's something very funny going on in the scientists' reaction, but yes, for the most part, they are, if not hostile, don't care about religion. But then there is, I could name you any of a number of good scientists who are deeply religious people.
So what's the difference between the religious, if you can categorize broad differences between scientists who are religious and scientists who are hostile to religion, how do the two groups differ?
They don't differ as scientists. I don't see it. So they differ when somehow they're asked to express their ideas about ideology. I think most scientists don't have any trouble with religion, but the ideology of science has somehow been pushed into an opposition to religion. Of course, I'm an unusual person, just to start the discussion. I'm an atheist who has a lot of respect for religion. There aren't too many of us. And I also have a feeling for ritual. I seem to have a natural feeling for ritual. The problem is it's not only, though I'm very close to the Jewish tradition in many ways. Problem with my Jewish friends who want to convert me back, and they're not only Lubavitcher, is that I respond just as well to Afro-Brazilian possession rights as I do to what goes on in a synagogue. So I have a feeling for religion and the spiritual, but I don't. But I am very close to the Jewish tradition. We'll get into that.
So let me back up a minute and ask you to elaborate a little bit. You're an atheist who has great respect for religion. Let's leave ritual out for a minute. So what does it mean? What do you mean by atheist? And then what do you mean, given what you mean by atheist, by great respect for religion?
Yes. So I'm not going to get elected anything by saying I'm an atheist, right, in this country. So you're not allowed to do that if you're running for public office. But I don't believe in the existence of a deity, yet I believe in the necessary existence of something like religion and its value to people. Okay, now the reason I think those scientists, like those guys I've mentioned, who have no use for religion, the most prominent spokesman of these, like Dawkins, I believe they've failed in, I said no need for religion, I didn't say God. I think they failed in a basic responsibility of scientists, which is to observe. And my observation, at least, and I don't think it's my own, is that in every culture in the world, from those you call primitive to those you call very sophisticated, every culture has found a need for religion of some sort or another. I think some of it stems from the same roots as science comes, from a curiosity about causes and origins, and then people persist in that. And science is not enough to make them happy. No technology. They need something else, something spiritual. While I think that science is spiritual, we'll come back to that. I don't think people, most people think of it that way. So I think there is a human need for religion. I think religion is an emergent human behavior, like humor, like literature, like music. It's something that's deeply in our soul, and I'm using that word metaphorically here now. Okay, the same observation of different societies leads me to think, from the very many different variegated forms that religious expression takes place, from paganism all the way to monotheism with everything in between, like Buddhism, that there is no God, that there is something like religion and a spiritual need, but God is doing an awfully good job of hiding himself in this, and I don't need a God. Furthermore, I've come to a time to form systems of ethics or morality, which is one reason for having a God, perhaps. Okay, so that's my reason for the atheism and the beginnings of my respect for religion. The other thing is I just love the way that various religious systems, in particular Judaism and to a large extent Catholicism, have built up scholarly structures, philosophical structures, to argue about things on a basis of a religious logic. And I love the Talmud, and I love the way that they reason, and I can get into their mind. And I have a lot of respect for the mind of the rabbis as they go through the arguments in the Talmud. So I understand their logic. I don't know, maybe it's illogical to think of that beautiful logic. And I also am interested in Buddhism somewhat, that to say that logic, that I understand that logic and I can get in their mind without accepting the God, but I can. Quite aside from religion.
So first of all, the religion part I agree with you on completely, meaning that religion is essentially a human phenomenon. It's about human relationships and human needs and human psychological drives and worries and fears and hopes and dreams. That's fine. In that respect, religion is a subcategory of human culture, and I can accept that completely. Just as language is a part of human culture. And by the way, they seem. Religion and language and music, these all seem to be universal, as if they're somehow hardwired into the species. That's fine, but I want to push you a little bit on God. You say you don't believe in a deity. Let me propose let me propose an idea and get your response to it. Very often when I talk with people about God, or actually I rarely initiate these conversations. Other people usually initiate them, and they always start out with, Rabbi, I don't mean any disrespect, but, by which they mean they think it's disrespectful, but they want to
Right.
be off the hook. I don't mean any disrespect, but I don't believe in God.
You find many people say
A lot of people, yeah. Now, that's not to say that there are lots of people who don't believe in God. That's just to say that a large percentage of the people who think they don't believe in God feel the need to tell rabbis that that's the case.
Right, right.
So I push them a little bit. I push and probe and prod a little bit, and it doesn't take long before we get a comment like, the old man with a white beard sitting up in heaven. As soon as I hear that, or any version of that, I think I understand exactly what's going on, and that's where I want to start the idea I'm going to propose to you. I say to them, it's not that you don't believe in God. Rather, you don't believe in one of the traditional literary portrayals of God. You may not believe in many of the traditional portrayals of God. God as old man with white beard sitting up in heaven. God as mighty warrior protecting his people from their enemies. God as whatever, right? What you're not believing in isn't God, but rather is various forms of what I call the metaphors by which we describe God.
one of them, though we...
Or many of them.
Yeah.
Or many of them. But here's the point. For me, and this is it's taken me quite a while to kind of formulate this thought. For me, God is the label I give to the observation that there are forces at work in reality that result in the reality that we live in being ordered and not chaotic, predictable more or less rather than random, and very, very finely and elegantly tuned. For me, that's where I start with a basic definition of God. In other words, God is the forces, if you will, the forces of nature, the forces that make the universe ordered rather than chaotic. That leads to other theological questions, which I'm delighted to get into. But let me just ask you to respond just to that. In other words, the possibility that we reject some or even all of the ancient metaphors, God as shepherd, God as father, God as king, and instead use new metaphors. Since we can't know God, at least according to most thinkers, most religious thinkers, we can't know God directly, we're kind of stuck with metaphors. So I'm willing to reject most or even all of the old metaphors, king, father, shepherd, etc., and come up with a new one. What's your response?
Well, first, I think human beings naturally make metaphors, they naturally make representations. Therefore, some religions have real problems, like Islam, which drives to the most non-representational imagery of God that we have. But even there, it cannot resist various forms of representation and language that it does. So I think it's part of what you say is don't believe in this old representation of this white guy with a beard or some modern version of it. Well, we have to represent him or her somehow. It's after a while, God is the totality of all these representations in some way. To me, in the same way, you find people saying, that's not me, that image of me. But it's really, the real me is not what it is when I'm talking to my parents or to my children. So, yes, we play roles, but this me is the totality of all of those. So I think we have to accept some picture of those representations. Otherwise, now what you're saying is we should construct some new metaphors. But part of that new metaphor that you constructed, you almost said, did you say something delicately balanced? Were you going to give me the watchmaker argument?
I said tuned, and I regretted it as soon as the word.
Yeah, I know. You were
passed my
perilously
mind.
close to those intelligent design arguments that I was arguing with. But I think, okay, your other definition was sort of wishy-washy. I mean, God is the totality of the forces of the universe. I actually agree. I'm so glad that you didn't say that God is the edge of the universe, the unknowable. That's the easiest, it is in some way, but it's the easiest sin of book writers, which both of us are, especially scientists writing pseudo-cosmological tracts. I'm thinking, for instance, Hawking, and part of the thing is the identification of God. You didn't make that mistake, but I'm often.
I would never make that mistake. I make other mistakes.
Yeah,
but
those
not
guys, they just, to identify God with what? With our ignorance? That, I think that's not, I think I'd identified both of us. We've got a question there. Let's actually take it. Why not?
In line with this, I believe that Einstein said God doesn't play dice with the universe or something like that.
Yes, he did.
In which he
Roughly.
maintained that there was a design, and I think he was saying this in opposition to the idea that it's just pure chance that everything evolves through this a contradictory theory. But the only thing is that the contradictory theory is proved to be very prescient in predicting the outcomes in the universe. So isn't there an argument that maybe there isn't an intelligent design in the universe? That it's up for grabs as to where this is going to play out in the long run. So that your argument that God is an intelligent design.
Neither of us said that.
He didn't say it.
Neither of us said
I was
that.
just pushing it. I think you're. If you ask me, I think there is no argument from intelligent design. But I think what David said was very clearly that we should identify God with the forces of nature that are in this world. And that's beautiful enough. And that gives a unity and an opening, a permission for science and religion to explore the same things. They explore them in different ways, different standards of reliable knowledge, truth. But I think you're right. What sounds wishy-washy to me about it, which is what I accused you of saying, is it sort of says, well, God is nature.
Why is that wishy-washy? It may be pantheistic, but it's not wishy-washy.
Yeah, it's well. First of all, if it were with nature, Jewish religious tradition would argue, I think, against nature. Is a very interesting where nature comes in, and how it comes into Jewish religious tradition is interesting. But I don't think it's in the sort of Orthodox interpretation. It's not what God is. Nature may be there to scare us. Nature may be there to lead us to God, but it's not what God is.
Before we get another question, I want to respond a little bit to nature and a little bit to the question of God playing dice. The idea of God, at least as a beginning proposition of God as equivalent to the laws of nature, that idea is essentially rooted in the scientific observation that nature runs according to rules. And once you figure out the rules for a given chunk of nature, whether it's the rules about fluid flow or the behavior of billiard balls as they whack into each other, or whatever the piece of nature is, you can predict. Once you have a good sense of the laws of any given chunk of nature, you can predict what will happen in that chunk of nature. And the prediction is pretty precise. And that's what Newton was all about, the prediction, pretty precise. Then along comes quantum mechanics and says, well, yeah, almost, but if you look at nature on a very, 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 very tiny level, there's some fundamental randomness and chance. That's what Einstein was upset about. I have no problem with seeing God as the forces of nature that are so predictable and so law-abiding. The problem that traditional religion often has with this is in something like a traditional, not the traditional, but a traditional doctrine of miracles, which says, well, yes, nature runs according to rules, but whenever God wants, God can suspend a rule. The sun won't rise tomorrow morning because God chooses to not have it rise. Or the sun will stop its course in the sky, as happens in the biblical story. That I don't believe. So, so in fact, what you've pointed out, and it's here I confess complete guilt, is that the idea I'm proposing is not in fact in line with the most traditional of Jewish philosophy. However, there have been lots of Jewish philosophies that have been at odds over the course of the centuries with the theological portrayal of God, say in the Torah or in early rabbinic literature.
I like it. We have questions.
Good.
We'll go. We can do it. Let's take this one here.
Questions. One, define religion. What do you mean by religion? And two, Rabbi Nelson, I think you're coming very close to the Kaplanian concept of God, the Mordechai Kaplan's concept of God. What is your thinking about Kaplan's definition of God? And then, of course, what do you mean by religion?
Well, I think, to restate, I think we already covered what religion is. Religion is this set of human needs and the behaviors that human beings seem universally to develop in response to those needs. They involve ritual, they involve belief, they involve prayer. They're responses to human needs, to the fact that the human condition is insecure, very often frightening. That we live in a big world that no matter when we live, whether we're in the 21st century or in the first century, there are lots of pieces of the world that seem mysterious and overwhelming and scary to us. And religion is one of the many ways that we come to terms with that. So it's a human phenomenon. In terms of Kaplan, again, guilty as charged. I'm not Mordechai Kaplan. I don't want to go into a whole thing about him, but he was the founder of the Reconstructionist movement and basically defined God as the force that makes for salvation in the universe. I think that's part of the truth, but I would go even farther and say that it's also the force that makes for awful things. It is all the forces of the universe. So I find myself, as I read and think and write, very sympathetic with Mordechai Kaplan's philosophy, but I am not Kaplanian, not really.
How about this question you asked me? I just wonder what you think, David, about, do you find scientists inimical to religion? Just this question that we started with, just from your experience.
Well, I'll answer it in two ways. What I've realized over the years is that more and more of my thinking and my writing and my work is autobiographical. This is not a big surprise, or at least it shouldn't be a big surprise. My father, Olav Shalom, was a chemist.
Oh, terrible.
And he was brought up in a traditional immigrant, Eastern European immigrant home where there was a very traditional religious environment. And he left it rather abruptly and rather angrily in his teenage years, and spent most of his life, as I remember him, railing against mumbo jumbo and the ritual. So the last point I'll make about him, then I'll move on to the other observation, is that late in his life, in his last years, he mellowed a little bit and wasn't quite as harsh about it. So that's just from my personal point of view. I find that a lot of scientists say in their writing that they are opposed to religion, but then I read what they write about the universe, and I say, no, you're opposed to or rejecting of some of the less stellar points of traditional religious belief and practice and expression. But when I read your writing, it sounds religious to me. This is often said of Einstein, that while he was not observant and didn't consider himself a religious or orthodox or observant Jew in any way. He did consider himself kind of small r religious or maybe spiritual. If you read his writing, there's a lot of deeply religious, kind of generically religious, not pegged to the trappings of a particular religious observance.
So the problem for those of us who are reflective and philosophical is how to not get identified as religious. Huh? I'd like to be identified as spiritual, not religious. What did you say?
I say it seems like you're identifying awe with religion
Awe.
and spirituality.
Mhm.
The scientist who's looking at something and cannot explain something and suddenly sees how something works is naturally going to be awed and want to look
Yes.
further and explore further. It doesn't mean that that person's becoming spiritual.
So you're touching on something which I want to take up, and that is that science is spiritual as science. That is, that sense of awe as science, that sense of seeing the double helix and knowing the sense implicit in the last sentence of the Watson-Crick paper that it has not escaped our attention. This is a mechanism for replication. Or the sense on seeing a symmetry argument for where from a simple argument, and this is something from my own work, that you can conclude something just from the fact that it's symmetric or anti-symmetric under reflection in a mirror, and that you can draw power from that has that sense of awe around it. It's more than interest. It's an approach to the sublime, a word which now has been sort of adulterated to mean just very beautiful, but it's more than beautiful. And that is there in the best of science, but it's also there in the everyday practice of science. It's what keeps people addicted to what we do. And how I wish we could communicate that better. Sometimes science writers do better than scientists almost at doing this. The scientists are so lost in their jargon, they have trouble expressing that awe. And they haven't learned the lesson from poets that you don't do it by saying, I am awed, or this is beautiful. That's the least informative statement in the world. But you have to you have to do it by showing how it is beautiful through a specific expression of the drop of dew on just this piece of grass and not any other piece of grass. And there is the universe. Now, if one can escape the jargon and do that, then a scientist is able to communicate.
So here's the problem, or here's a problem. Whenever I hear the word awe in the context of a discussion of religion and nature, I'm reminded of the beautiful writing of Abraham Joshua Heschel. Great, brilliant Orthodox rabbi, theologian, philosopher of the 20th century. And he writes about awe. He also sometimes calls it radical amazement. He means by radical amazement in your root, at the core of your being. And he talks about, he doesn't talk about it in scientific terms, he talks about it in natural terms. The awe and mystery and radical amazement you experience when you see a thunderstorm or a baby being born or a drop of dew on a leaf. And it's beautiful and it's inspiring and it's wonderful and I remember reading in rabbinic school many years ago, the whole first half of the book, I kept reading. I said, wow, this is great. Wow, this is great. Then he got to the second half of the book, where somehow he made a transition that I just wasn't buying between awe and radical amazement. Mm-hmm. And that's why you have to keep the commandments that God commanded. I just was never able to understand and accept the leap that he made from the awe of a beautiful day or a starry night to, and there was God on Mount Sinai giving us commandments, and that's why we have to follow them.
Well, I think by trying to get into his logic, I think that once you accept the existence of God, what he was saying was in line with, in another way, in line with the end of the book of Job, with God talking out of the whirlwind. And here, if you accept that some being is responsible for this in some way, and that much of it is as yet unknowable, so we'll accept your picture that it's possibly knowable eventually, if God is nature, that a reminder of one set of beauty, a sunset, something natural, let me pick, or also something unnatural as a Haydn trio is, which is as unnatural as the molecules are made in the laboratory. Nothing natural about a Haydn trio. That also can lead you to the wonder of the Almighty, if you accept the Almighty. You see what I'm doing here? I'm giving you the religious argument.
We seem to have switched roles. So it occurs to me that there's an interesting parallel, I think. Let me present it and see if you agree that it's a parallel between the way, and I won't speak about religion in general, but Judaism in particular works and the way science works. We start out in Judaism, I mentioned Heschel a moment ago. Heschel talks about awe and mystery and the majesty of the universe, and yet when you go into a yeshiva, you spend much of your time, perhaps even most of your time,
banging on the table.
Banging on the table is one thing. That could be fun, but what are you banging about? You're banging about the tiniest details of a system, a legal system, that is about, to give one quick example, how many square inches of matzah one must eat in how many minutes and seconds to fulfill the commandment of eating matzah. And if you eat half a square inch less in the prescribed time, or if you take 10 seconds more than the prescribed time, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. So there is a disconnect between the awe and the mystery on the one hand, and the details.
That's no different from doing science.
Exactly.
All this tedious stuff. I mean, and Watson and Crick took months to build that wire model, and at the end is this paper. There is this masterpiece. I could show you the drafts of Mendeleev of his periodic table, or of William Blake of his poems, and they are drafts, they are work, there's labor, there's a lot of tedious stuff on the way to that revelation.
On the way to the revelation implies that the tedious stuff leads to the revelation, but what happens if it's the other way around? You get the revelation, and then when you start pulling it apart, what you end up being engaged in, I almost said mired in, but that's very negative. Engaged in is the little details of either the lab work, the molecules, or the kashrut, or whatever it is.
The Hasidic argument would be, in those little details are sparks of God.
Science happens that way too.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do see the revolution, and then you go through generations and generations of scientists arguing over the nitpickiest little things.
Yes.
The original experiments that led to relativity or to the quantum thesis, that was argued, it's still being argued by people looking at tiny little details of experiments.
Well.
Yeah, sure, please.
To me, God is revealed in the beauty of nature and the laws of nature. Why are there laws of nature? That's God.
Yeah.
I don't believe in an interfering God. God gave us the world, the natural beauty. What man does with it is his own doing. That's the way I feel about God.
There are so many constructions, and as many constructions of Jewish identity. I mean, I don't believe in God, but I'm very Jewish. Of course, I was defined that way in part by surviving the Holocaust. But even aside from that, I'd be Jewish, and interesting.
I just want to take issue. I agree with what you said 99%. But why bother with the 99% when I can focus on the 1% where we disagree? According to what you said, there are rules in nature,
The laws of science.
laws of science, but then at the end you threw in, it was just kind of a throwaway line, but human beings can do whatever we want. Well, but in order to make that jump, you've got to assume that we are outside of the laws of nature. If we're in fact a part of the laws of nature, then how come we don't behave in law-abiding or rule-following ways? And it's a real problem. It's a real philosophical problem that both religion and science deal with. I want to come back, though, to an earlier question and raise a different side of the tension, if there is tension, between science and religion. I want to suggest, and Roald, get your response to this, that perhaps one of the things that religion and science fight about is the sources of truth, where and how we get truth. Let me throw out a very, very sketchy definition, and that being that scientists get truth by observing things, that's data, and analyzing what they observe and drawing conclusions, whereas religionists, people of religion, get truth often, at least by their own claim, by being revealed to, having truth revealed to them by God, by prophets, in a way that is not open or susceptible to understanding and analysis. You just have to accept it. It's a very, very basic outline of a dichotomy. What do you think of the dichotomy?
Well, I have trouble within science. I'm a little bit in a minority there with the word truth. I would prefer reliable knowledge or approaches to truth. The reason I don't like truth is that if we set ourselves up as priests of the truth in science, we have that much further to fall. So a lot of the interest in fraud in science, which is violations of this, of truth, values, and ethics, has much akin with our prurient interest in the sexual misdeeds of our priests or rabbis, just so we don't. And the reason is that we set ourselves up on a pedestal, we got to fall. So I'd rather talk about reliable knowledge, okay, approaches to truth. I think your characterization in general is okay, but it's got so many, in my mind, it's got so many surrounding things around it. It's a sort of idealized textbook picture of science, not the way that science works. We are often receive large sections of the truth from our fathers, in a sense, our doctor fathers. And we, at the same time, the Oedipal principle is very strong. So you make your reputation by killing your fathers, figuratively, in science. And it's the cult of the new, and that two feed off each other. But a lot of it is received truth. But here's my definition of science. You actually gave, we're talking about definitions of religion, and you gave a partial definition of science, and I have another one which is a partial one. So science is an activity of curious people, some of whom don't mind to getting their hands dirty. So experiment is absolutely necessary. That it has built, it's a social system for gaining reliable knowledge, built on curious but fallible people. The fallible part is very important. What it means is that people, if they see an experiment by someone that has something interesting, try to prove it wrong rather than right. Okay? They invest more energy to prove somebody else wrong than to invest the energy to prove it right. And it's okay for the system. It's not okay necessarily, though T.S. Eliot in Murder in a Cathedral said something like, "But this be the greatest treason, to do the right thing for the wrong reason." So curious but fallible people engaged in a search, some of them experimenters, constructing a system for communicating their knowledge to each other, which is part of the system, but becomes an addiction to publish, which then serves an ethical function of debating in the process of publication what you reveal and what you conceal, because you know somebody else might test it, might reproduce the results. And then at the end of it is a system, another part of the system of science is a dipping back and forth between wild flights of fancy, which some call theory, and contact through our fallible senses and our instruments with reality. This is not an argument for what's wrong with string theory, but in it are. So these are parts of the system of science, and that looks rather different in large part than religious systems. But as I sat down to write a book with Shira Leibowitz-Schmidt about issues of science and religious tradition, I saw that there was something special about Jewish religious tradition, because what's going on in the Talmud is not so much theology. It is discussion of whether if you trip over a flask of wine that's on the way to the loading dock and you break it, who's responsible for that? And that's very down-to-earth working out of these things. And I sort of liked that. It had a practical sense. I liked the whole idea of the Talmud and the fact that you had to write 50 volumes because you couldn't live a life just according to the Bible. You had to worry about getting divorced. And so that was, so that there's a tractate in there. And you had to worry about what to do with saying the morning blessings when you couldn't see whether it was morning. You didn't have a GPS system. So these were interesting to me. So I think that in religion there is also attention to detail, but I think you're by and large right. There is a received logic from which you argue, and then the arguments are different in the different religions, reach different conclusions.
Although, let me now go back and contradict my my earlier characterization of science and religion in the following way. If you read halachic literature, if you read the Jewish legal literature about any question, it can be a question that may sound to many ears silly, like the question about the number of square inches of matzah, or it may sound very sophisticated, like what does the halacha, the Jewish law, have to say about embryonic stem cell research, whatever, much more sophisticated, interesting issues. Doesn't matter what the issues are. And you read it carefully, the question, what does God want or expect or permit or prohibit, will never be asked. It's not there. The argument is never about what does God want me to do or require me to do. It's about this rabbi says this and this rabbi says that and this system says this. And so there is almost a disconnect, at least in practical terms, there's a complete disconnect between the fundamental deeply underlying fact of revealed religion and the practical matter of deciding what is permitted and what is prohibited.
I don't think there's disconnect. If I were religious, I would argue that every aspect of a Jew's life is sanctification of the name and the compact between God and his people. And every mundane action is an example of that, the sanctity of that compact and of God. And in that action one must behave in the stupidity of tripping over a flask on the way to the loading dock, one must behave in accord with halacha, and one must seek how how this would be seen in the light of the revealed revelations of the Bible, and with respect for the authority in the commentaries and the rabbis. And unfortunately, Kilo b'shamayim, it is, unfortunately, it is not all written down in heaven, but it is up to us as human beings to find out that proper way, the halakhic way. I understand that, and I sympathize with it, though even as I don't accept the whole framework.
I want to find out a little bit more about truth and knowledge and ask one question,
Yes.
and then we've got some more questions here.
Yeah.
Einstein is said to have been asked just when some great expedition was going. I think was it Eddington's expedition in 1919,
Yes.
expedition to observe an eclipse. This expedition was going apparently, perhaps going to prove the truth of general relativity. And I've read that Einstein was asked by someone, what will you do? How will you react if the data of the expedition don't match your theory? And he said something like, I will assume that the data are mistaken.
Yes.
Right?
It's interesting.
So how does that tie into the distinction you made between truth and reliable knowledge?
Yeah. I think we're seeing here the fallibility of human beings. Even Einstein makes mistakes, and that is, we are each driven to believe that we are right, but the system advances of science off that often mistaken belief. And scientists don't accept experiments by others proving they're wrong. Old scientists never die, they just fade away. This is what happens. And it's okay as long as there are 100,000 people doing this, but if there are only 2 people doing it, you're in trouble in science. We have a good system in place. Any questions? Now let's get somebody who hasn't asked a question back there. Yes.
I've just been wondering, if God is nature, then what is the difference in that statement? The difference between that statement and nature is nature. What makes it God? So I'm trying to figure out exactly what we're debating here. I don't think either of you disagree that there is nature and laws of nature guiding existence.
Right. Yes, that's for you, David.
Oh, that's for me? Next question, please. No. Look, it's a good question. What you're asking, I think, is once we agree that nature is nature and nature has rules by which it runs, what is the value added, if you will? What more do we get by then identifying nature or the laws of nature as God, right? Yes. There is perhaps a difference. First of all, I wouldn't say nature, God is nature. I would say that God is the laws and structures that underlie and are responsible for the functioning of nature. So it's a little bit different. When I say it is God, what I'm talking about is now coming back full circle to religion. Religion, to a certain extent, is that label given to that broad grouping of human activities that are engaged in the search for meaning. One of the most frightening things possible for human beings to contemplate is the idea that, in fact, there is no meaning in reality. It's all meaningless. And so once we've been pretty successful at feeding ourselves and clothing ourselves and protecting ourselves from the elements and from our enemies, in other words, we've got our basic needs taken care of, we start spending a tremendous amount of time looking for meaning. And we look for meaning by writing poetry and playing music and creating art, and also by doing religion. When we talk, perhaps the difference that I'm groping for here is that when we talk about laws of nature simply as laws of nature, it is possible simply to observe them and to remark on them. Oh, there are laws of nature. Every single time I drop the rock, it falls, and you can count on it. Not 99 times out of 100, but 100 times out of 100, it falls. That's a law. As opposed to calling it God, where we begin to see this as being part of the underlying meaning of the universe. Now you're going to ask what meaning means, and I don't know if I can answer that.
Yeah, I agree in general. I think, well, let me get it another way. So we have, with science and technology, improved the human condition. You only have to take a walk in a 19th century graveyard to see all the children who died at age 4 or 5. And the lifespan has gone from 40 for men and women both in most of Europe and in the United States to over 75. And yet people are no happier. Neither are they neither are they praising the technology and science, in which my own chemistry played a large part for that advance. And part of it is social organization, as well as the, for instance, of health systems, as well as the science and technology. So you could say, well, people are people, they're never going to be happy. They're always going to want to be Pope, as in some fable, so that they're never going to be happy. But I think there is more to it, that is that the science and technology does not answer some of the basic questions of meaning and science continues worse in some fits of arrogance. It begins to say that those questions of meaning are meaningless questions. I mean, if freshmen in a university can still discuss free will and determinism, there must be nothing to that question. Or they hide it in some obscurantism of quantum logic having something to say about that, which I think is equally bad. But I think so. Those questions of meaning, I think, are always going to be outside of science. I think no sociobiological explanation is eventually going to reveal to us those questions of meaning. They are inherently human. I don't think science will provide them. And I think there is a difference between religion and science, that at least not this meaningless rituals that we talked about, but those other things, which I think the rituals, the usual justification in Jewish law for the rituals is they lead you, as often repetitive behavior does. First, they lead you not to violate certain things, but they also may lead not everyone. Maybe there is a difference between Am Yisrael and some other people that lead you into contemplation of the important things. And I think that ritual can have that aspect. It's interesting that mystical threads in various religions often have repeated activity of some sort as part of the way in, and sometimes deprivation of the body in various ways, as a way into mystical experience. Yes?
It seems like this discussion is kind of centered around the center of a spectrum where you have religion, a deeply religious person on one side and a deeply scientific person on the other. We're having a debate around kind of the center.
Yes.
Can you guys comment on maybe the further extremes in the opposite direction of where you guys currently sit? Because I think your definition of God right from the beginning was very simple.
Was very central, yeah.
So what you're saying is that we don't disagree enough.
We don't, yeah. So the extreme scientific position is that religion is just superstition, that at a certain stage in the development of humanity, it had positive effects in explaining things and providing social coherence, but now that science has produced the beginnings of total explanations for this world, we don't need any religion. And then that argument would continue to point at everything bad that religion has done, like being used like politics, to kill people. That their history is one of unremitting use of religion to kill other people, to polarize societies, and it would point to the obvious illogic. It would give the classical argument of God, how could God create the Nazi regime and the Holocaust? Say that's obvious that God can't argue from that. This is the theodicy argument, and it just would continue like that. I'm prone to argue with that person, but there are people who would do that.
And the extreme religious position, for which I have very little patience, actually, personally, and your observation is a good one. Although, as they say, it's not rocket science, because it's pretty clear, I think, that we are relatively close together. But the extreme position of religion is that I believe, period, full stop, and that belief can withstand any and all assaults of evidence, because you can't believe evidence. I mean, evidence is just stuff that you see. And if you look at the history of the so-called truths that are arrived at by examining evidence, you find that one after another have fallen away as the basic beliefs have remained steady. I mean, there were actually times when biologists or physicians believed that the whole body was controlled by 4 fluids, and it was the balance or imbalance of these 4 fluids. I mean, how silly was that? But it was science. It was the best science of the day. Well, obviously, it's a lot of nonsense. The really enduring things are the beliefs. Now let me step out of that position that I don't really accept to point out something interesting. When I did a bunch of reading a few years back on string theory, which is a fascinating topic. I'm sure it's fascinating mathematically, but you'd never be able to prove it by me. But it's fascinating philosophically, because the string theorists say things like, string theory is a relatively new theory in physics that tries to reconcile the fact that the laws of general relativity, which describe very, very precisely and beautifully the behavior of very large, heavy things like stars and galaxies, and the laws of quantum mechanics, which seem to describe absolutely brilliantly the behavior of tiny, tiny, tiny subatomic things, there is a point at which these two sets of laws, general relativity and quantum mechanics, are in conflict. And I have read some string theorists who say things like, we can't believe that at its core the universe would operate by 2 sets of rules. We believe deeply that there must be a single set of rules at the core of the universe. Well, I read that and I say, this is not a scientific statement. This is, in fact, a perhaps small r religious statement. In other words, it's a statement of belief. It's a statement that doesn't necessarily seem, at least from the non-technical description that I read, to be rooted in evidence. As a matter of fact, it contradicts the evidence that big things are ruled by general relativity and little things are ruled by quantum mechanics. But it says, nevertheless, we believe that there's one set of rules. And then they come up with string theory as the possibility of that set.
I think that it betrays another aspect of the human behavior, and that is our abiding preference for simplicity. So equations that are... So here's the simplicity. A simple thing is that there must be one theory. A particular demonstration of that from which physicists are prone are that this equation must be right because it's simple or beautiful. Or for chemists, it's likely to come in an admiration for molecules that look like platonic solids, like cubes or tetrahedral. And there you have hemoglobin or our enzymes, which look like a real mess. And that's why they work. And then you have a preference for simple mechanisms. So if something can happen in one fell swoop. It's usually preferred to something that happens in 17 complicated steps. I've made a living out of this. Some of you who know my chemistry.
But is it true?
No, it's not true.
Okay.
The world is complicated, but a part of it is sort of... So the mind is simplistic, and part of that is that attitude is betrayed. Let's see. You. Yes. I'll repeat the question.
Just to go back to that area for one question to simplify things, because when you're talking about the beliefs of scientists, if you look at Judaism and the Orthodox, conservative, and the Reform, I won't argue between the secular and the atheists, where they belong. Are there differences in the attitudes towards science in those different groups? Some of whom believe that everything is based on divine law, and others, by the way, diplomats say, if you're going to deal with somebody that you have to come to a conclusion with, don't take anybody who believes it's written down in the Bible or some other place, and it's got to be that way, because they'll never budge for any kind of position to another position that might satisfy a problem that exists between 2 or 3 or 4 groups.
I'll just repeat the question. Yeah. Maybe you can repeat.
So the question is, are there differences among just to take a small sampling of the spectrum, Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Jews or their Judaisms with regard to their attitudes towards science? So the temptation is to imagine that that the Orthodox, the temptation from without is to imagine that orthodoxy is really fundamentalism, and therefore it is similar to the kind of fundamentalism that gives us creationism in the Kansas State School Board debate. In fact, although that I'm sure that exists in places, I am fascinated by the extent to which it does not exist. I'll give you one quick example. And by this example, I mean to say that at least among some individuals, there is not a consistent difference with regard to attitudes towards science between, say, Orthodox, conservative, and Reform. So you may be aware of a book and a whole movement that started a few decades ago called the Bible Codes. Sound familiar? Yes? Bible Codes basically lays out the text of the Bible in Hebrew or of any given piece of the Bible in Hebrew in a matrix. In other words, not in a book, but you write the letters out in lines, and then you find remarkable patterns. And I'm going to make one up, but it's the kind of example that would be that would be typical in the Bible codes. If you start from the 5th letter of the 5th word in the 5th chapter of biblical book X, whatever it is, and you count every 50 letters and you string them together, you get a message that says Israel's independence in 1948. Right, which proves, according to the Bible code, folks, and I'm oversimplifying, and it's never fair to oversimplify, but I'm oversimplifying anyway. So as long as I admit that it's not fair, I guess it's okay. But which proves, according to the Bible code, folks, that the Bible, in fact, has absolute truths that are put there by God. They're hidden there by God, and they're true. And obviously they're true because the Bible is an ancient work, and it predicted something that wasn't going to happen until the middle of the 20th century. That's miraculous. I mean, no human author, no matter how clever, could ever have hidden that in there, right? So much for the modern biblical criticism that says that the Bible was written by human hands. I mean, that's just silly. It must have been God. So some years back, I read an article by 2 Orthodox mathematicians. But if you go to their website, we're not talking like Orthodox, like a tiny little kippah. We're talking a hat and a beard and a dark suit. Serious, at least in terms of the pictures, and I realize this is very much a stereotype, serious Orthodox men. One, I think, is at Harvard or MIT, and the other is in California, maybe Caltech or Stanford, I don't remember. Big name schools. 2 mathematicians. And they write an article about the Bible codes. And they say, imagine that you lay the literature out in a matrix, and you find the following things, and it lists several 20th century events that are predicted by the code. And it's a long paragraph, this and this and this and this and this date and this event. And then it says, it's remarkable, isn't it? It would be even more remarkable if this text were from the Bible. But it's from Moby Dick. In other words, these are two mathematicians and computer scientists whose claim is that there's no rule in the Bible codes about how you set up the matrix, right? How you count and how many letters you count. So given a sophisticated enough system, for example, a very, very powerful computer, you can take any literature. You can take Shakespeare, you can take the Bible, you can take Moby Dick or Charles Dickens or whoever and find great truths in it. Right? So, and I was, again, I don't know enough math to critique the article on its merits, but the fact that we had two seriously self-identified Orthodox Jewish mathematicians who are essentially claiming that this Bible code, which tends to be seen as a kind of a fundamentalist Jewish approach, was simply nonsense, simply not true, was a very, very useful and eye-opening observation for me. The one other example that I'll give, there's an Orthodox Jewish physicist by the name of Schroeder who's written several books, and I'm not sure what I'm about to say, where what I'm about to say falls in this spectrum, several books in which he proves, perhaps I should put that in quotes, in which he proves, by using modern physics, and he's a serious physicist, professor of physics somewhere, I don't remember where, the truth, again in quotes, of the creation story as it appears in Bereshit, in the first chapter of Genesis. Now, that's a very, very different orthodox use of science. So what I guess I'm saying, the bottom line is that it's been my experience that there is no easy and convenient mapping of orthodox equals fundamentalism equals rejection of science, and reform equals liberalism equals acceptance of science. There's going to be more general acceptance of science, I think, in the more liberal end of the Jewish spectrum, because that more liberal end of the Jewish spectrum is going to be more convinced by and a part of the wisdom and understanding of modern culture in any event. But the other end of the spectrum is almost not at all predictable.
Can't you make any predictions using pilpulism also, by the way you interpret the numbers and the choice of the letters they'd be using?
Yeah. Yes, you can.
So why is that any different from what you're saying?
It's in a tradition of gematria, of doing these things, what that code, except what the code is, that code stuff has a pseudoscientific attachment. That's what's, it has the same pseudoscientific attachment that the labels of your herbal medicines have in your natural food department. They use the science in order to sell something else, and that is, in that context, especially when it's tied to religion, it just seems so exploitative and horrible, this code stuff, even worse than the Da Vinci Code.
You're talking about the book or the movie? There were a bunch of hands that went up.
There's one back there. Let's somebody. I'm trying to get people with that.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on fear as a motivator for
Yes.
belief in God, and the dichotomy between the fear of something that's unknown and the quest of scientists for the known, for learning the known.
Well, it's interesting. So fear is not a bad motivation for some things, and forming some simple ethical systems, I believe. We always say that we should do things out of reason, but many of us know the simplest thing is, since both of us are writers, deadlines. That's a kind of fear. You have to get it done. Usually our sense of duty is stronger than anything else, and that fear wins out over, whereas if we have an open afternoon, we don't wind up writing, some of us. So now, fear and science. It's interesting. One way to think sort of poetically about science is that naming things and classifying them, one of the basic scientific activities, has a way of domesticating fear. It domesticates unexpectedness. Explanations in general do. But naming things, Menashe ben Israel in Renaissance times named devils, and that, like naming diseases, that made you feel better about the universe. Once we had the name, what's amazing is when classification systems have some reality. That's the beauty of Linnaeus classification. But a lot of what theoreticians do in my field is rephrase problems, rename them without solving them. A typical activity of theoretical chemists. Anyway, fear is operative. Fear of the unknown, of letting things be. The science is, I think, some of the reaction to the kinds of questions in the humanities come out of saying that those things which are not susceptible of a solution are not things worth studying. One extreme of an arrogant attitude of scientists, which I perceive as there. You see why I'm more sensitive to it, because I also write poetry. No, don't worry about it. We're not, you mean, yes, I was going to show some slides in case you people weren't going to ask some questions. But
so let me briefly say something about fear. I tell a story in the last chapter of Judaism, Physics, and God about a fascinating encounter I had a bunch of years ago with a born-again Christian woman. We were on a boat together for 3 days before small boat, so that we kept crossing paths. And finally, after about 3 days, she and I had an opportunity to sit down and have a long talk about religion and faith, and I learned something very interesting. I learned that there was a basic difference between her religion and faith and my religion and faith. Her religion and faith was all about certainty and answers and comfort and knowing what's supposed to be. And it gave her tremendous comfort and tremendous relief. And one could characterize it, I think, as an absolute response to fear. My religion and faith, on the other hand, is not about answers, it's about questions. It's not about security, it's about insecurity. I am fascinated by those aspects of Jewish philosophy and Jewish theology historically that say there are things we just can't know. There are absolute limits to our ability to know. Whether it's Job, where God just says to Job at the end of the book, sorry, you can't know, you are a finite human being, don't even try. All the way to the medieval mystics who talk about God as Ein Sof, without end, and they say, you human beings, you finite, measly little human beings might be able to understand some of the lowest emanations of God, like Shekhinah, but certainly Ein Sof, you have no chance of, it's completely hidden from you. Not that you'll eventually get smart enough that you can't be smart enough. There's an absolute gap. Those are the parts of religion, and by the way, the parts of physics that fascinate me. The fact that there are things that physicists say we just can't know. You can't know what the quantum state of a particle is going to be until it gets there. You can't predict it, right? So the idea that our knowledge or our access to truth, because I'm still not comfortable with the distinction that you make, is fundamentally limited and that makes me uncomfortable, I find that fascinating.
Yeah. We have to actually close. Maybe we can make some. We can talk afterwards. You want to make a comment? Okay, you're dying to make a comment.
What is your faith based on? Based on what you've just said, then what is your faith based on?
We would not deny people answers.
How can we do that in 2 minutes? I'm kidding. It's a huge. What is my faith? In that case, what is my faith based on? It is a huge question. Couple of quick pieces of an answer, but with the caveat that they are grossly inadequate to the depth of the question. In part, my faith is based on a sense of community. In that respect, my Jewish religious life and faith are like virtually all Jewish religious life and faith, deeply dependent on community. They can't be done alone, and on the interaction between me and the members of my community. That's one piece of it. Another piece of it is a faith in the sustenance I get from simply being in a state of searching. In other words, the act of searching is itself a sustaining activity for me, a sustaining religious activity, even if I start out the search with the assumption that I cannot find the object of my search. That's a woefully inadequate answer to a question that deserves a much longer discussion.
Let me close by just telling you a little bit of a story of a spiritual moment in science. And I was going to show it in some slides. So, as you know, there is this. No, I will talk about it without the slide. It's okay. Incidentally, we will stay around as much as possible to talk to people afterwards, so don't worry. You know, there is this blue pigment, the chelet, which is used to color a fringe of a garment, and it came from a snail, and its use was lost by the Jews around the time of the reduction of the Talmud. It's the same pigment as Tyrian purple. It's a mixture of two compounds that comes from snails of various kinds in the Mediterranean. Indigo also comes from a plant, and two plants, from indigo plant from woad. Anyway, there have been various people trying. We now understand these things, but the custom of coloring that thread blue cannot be simply restituted because it's tied up with mythology about it not being available till the coming of the Messiah. And so that's another barrier. But meanwhile, people are trying to reintroduce that blue. And I was working with some young people, graduates of Yeshiva University in Israel, who said that we should have listened to that chemistry course we had better, because they were turned into chemists. And we were fishing for these snails, and we got them up, and then we were doing that process of getting the blue at Tel Dor, about where the mountains from the Carmel turn into the sea. And there is a Phoenician site, archaeological site, where this blue was processed in ancient times, the chelet, from the snails. In order to process it, you had to do some chemistry, which was done with simple chemicals then available. Because the blue itself from the snails, if you rub the snail on your hand, it stains it blue, but it washes off. The same on a t-shirt. It'll wash off in two washings, and you can't sell something that washes off in two washings then or now. So in order to make it a good dye, it's the same dye that makes blue jeans. So that indigo, to make the good dye from it, you have to first transform it into another form, which is absorbed by the protein of the wool or the cellulose of the cotton, into it, and then in a second chemical step, it returns to the blue. So you go from blue to colorless to blue. Blue is the sky. Blue is the throne of God, it was said. Anyway, that process, the first process, that blue is very precious. It took 10,000 snails to color one Roman toga in a royal blue. A very precious material, and you had to make it disappear from blue into colorless, then to absorb it into the fabric, and then when you took it out to the air, just the oxygen in the air, I'm desperately trying to avoid the word reduction and oxidation, but the oxygen of the air turns it back to the blue form magically. But what furthermore, that first step of turning it colorless in the old days was done with urine. Fermented urine is a good reducing agent. Preferably from men who have drunk strong drink. Anyway, this was done by the Philistines, who were better at many things, better than the Israelites, and this was one of them. And imagine, and we were the pictures of us doing that process with modern chemistry, so don't worry. In Tel Dor, in a Phoenician dyeing pit, and were transformed this stinking mess from the snails into the colorless one, and then dip the cotton. As I take out the cotton, it turns blue. Now, knowing the chemistry, which I haven't told you except rough outline, to me, combined with doing it in that place and doing that, and knowing the history of both the Tyrian purple and the use of techelet in Jewish ritual lore, that's a deeply spiritual moment when you see that coming blue. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.